to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be talking about trade weapons, especially sanctions, and see if they work when applied against different countries like China, Russia, or North Korea. My guest is an expert on this topic. Mr. Ken Heydon is a former Australian government trade official and a senior member of the OECD Secretariat and a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics. His latest book is The Trade Weapon: How Weaponizing Trade Threatens Growth, Public Health, and the Climate Transition. His earlier works include The Rise of Bilateralism, plus the Ashgate Research Companion and International Trade Policy. Heydon, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate you being with me. Thank you so much. We're going to get into your book in just a minute, but let's just for a moment talk about OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. What is that? Just very briefly, the mission, and when was it formed?
Okay, well, OECD is an international policy setting body. It has a secretariat who prepare papers that are discussed in committees. And this is the key thing. The committees are made up of government officials from the member countries. So if something is accepted, there's a pretty good chance that it will become government policy. And over the years, this has led to some very important international norms, like the polluter pays principle, more recently, principles for taxing multinational enterprises. So some pretty important work comes out because of this link between the analysis and the involvement of government officials. OECD began life after the Second World War as the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, was then broadened and now has 38 members, including shortly Indonesia and Mexico. So it's predominantly the advanced economies, but it is very closely engaged with non-members and with various international bodies, particularly UN bodies.
Mm-hmm. That was my next question. Thank you. You led me right into it. How do you interact with the United Nations? And I know there are a lot of UN bodies, UN Conference on Trade and Development, just on across the board, UN Development Program. But generally speaking, how do you interact with them?
Well, there's pretty close link, for example, with UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development. And just to give one example of that, some years ago, OECD did work applying the rules of trade for goods to trade and services. Developing countries were somewhat apprehensive about this, so OECD worked very closely with UNCTAD to engage with developing countries. Currently, OECD has close links with the G20 process, often prepares papers for discussion by the G20, which in turn has very close links with various UN bodies, as well as the World Bank, IMF, and World Trade Organization.
Yes. Well, before I forget it, let me mention if our viewers would like more information, they can go to www.oecd.org and learn much more about this very interesting international organization, and a very important one too. And you mentioned the United Nations. So many of these bodies were set up immediately after World War II or shortly before the war ended, like with the United Nations, NATO, the OECD, and just a variety of others. And of course, if our viewers would like information on the UN, they can go to www.un.org. Well, I appreciate that overview. Let's jump into your book, The Trade Weapon: How Weaponizing Trade Threatens Growth, Public Health, and the Climate Transition. What is the trade weapon you're referring to?
The trade weapon involves government intervention, government restrictions on imports and exports, and extensive use of state-funded subsidies. And there are two key elements to the weaponization of trade in using those interventions. One is that the measures are usually applied on a unilateral basis, not within the framework of an international organization. And the second is that the measures are invoked in the name of goals that go beyond trade, which I'm sure we'll get onto, but it's outside the realm of trade. It's in effect hijacking trade policy in the service of other objectives. The problem being, it's not a very effective way of dealing with those objectives.
Mm-hmm. And what are a couple of examples of this application of this trade weapon that it's really counterproductive?
Well, let's take a very recent one. One of the motivations of using the trade weapon is to try and secure one's position in the global value chain. And the United States has extensively restricted exports, particularly of semiconductors, of chips, to China, seeing China clearly as a threat in this area. But the latest smartphone from Huawei, which has just been released, somehow uses precisely the semiconductor that the United States has banned the export of to China. So restrictions of this nature deny the country applying the restrictions opportunities to export, and are more likely to stimulate innovation in the target country, which is precisely what has happened in this case.
Mm-hmm. Now, in this whole discussion, I mentioned sanctions in the opening. It seems like that the toolkits that the various countries and organizations have, they have a variety of items they can apply, I guess, against a country. For example, North Korea comes to mind. The United Nations has applied sanctions against North Korea. We've seen the U.S. has applied sanctions against China, North Korea, Iran, just on across the board, it seems like. But do the sanctions actually work? And if they don't, what would be an alternative to applying sanctions? What can be done to help get another country to basically we're trying to make them think the same way we do, which may or may not work. But what can be done to replace the sanction?
Okay. Well, your first question, do they work? One has to conclude that by and large, they don't work. They certainly don't work very well. You mentioned the sanctions against North Korea in view of its nuclear weapons program. These sanctions have been applied for many years now. The result is that Kim Jong-un can now make a nuclear strike anywhere in North America. The sanctions have not slowed down his program. The sanctions against Vladimir Putin for his invasion of Ukraine have not changed his behavior, and there are many examples. You also mentioned sanctions against Iran. So they tend not to be effective, and there are a number of reasons for that. One is the ability of the target country to withstand pain, the ability of the target country to impose pain, and very important, the expectation of future conflict. If a target country thinks that there's a pretty good chance of confrontation continuing, they're less likely to comply with the sanctions because that will reduce their bargaining position in those future confrontations. So confrontation expectation is pretty important. What can be done? For most of the trade weapons that I talk about, I'm suggesting alternatives, do something else. Sanctions is a little bit different because there is a moral compunction, a moral obligation to do something. So I'm not saying get rid of sanctions, but an important requirement is that the stick of sanctions be accompanied by the carrot of classic diplomacy. So you don't rely entirely on these sanctions, which are not particularly effective. So again, coming back to the example of North Korea, a deal was almost reached under the presidency of Donald Trump, I think in February 2020, when the US was offering infrastructure development for the development of North Korea's transport system, infrastructure, basically. Kim Jong-un came pretty close to accepting that, and as a condition, would have slowed down or abandoned aspects of his nuclear weapons program. Ukraine is very, very difficult, and I don't claim to have the answers, but part of the answer has to be, I think, an assurance to Russia about Ukraine's status. It may mean something short of full membership of NATO, but clearly this is a matter that would require intense diplomatic negotiation. The key thing is not to rely entirely on sanctions, but to draw on classic diplomacy to improve the chances that sanctions might in fact work, or that the promise of withdrawing sanctions might be more effective.
You're absolutely right. There was an opportunity. There was also one during George W. Bush's administration, and he scotched that deal. And so that took care of that. Well, we're going to come back and talk about these in just a moment. Well, you're watching
Yes.
Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows, you'd like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're going to be taking a look at that broad area of trade and what is most effective as far as trying to work with other countries. My guest is an expert on this topic. Mr. Ken Heydon is a former Australian government trade official and senior member of the OECD Secretariat and a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics. His latest book is The Trade Weapon: How Weaponizing Trade Threatens Growth, Public Health, and the Climate Transition. You were talking about some situations where we had a chance to broker a deal with the North Koreans. It seems like history is littered with failed applications of sanctions. The U.S. has had a sanction on Cuba, a trade embargo, for decades now. It's been a total failure. It's embarrassed the United States at the UN. Every year, most of the countries at the UN, our friends, our allies, vote against us, and it's counterproductive. It's not working, and it should be changed. I know President Obama tried to do it, but then things went awry on that. We saw not long ago the Iranian nuclear deal, which was working. We were actually containing Iran's nuclear ambitions until former President Trump broke the deal, saying that he was going to come back and broker a new deal, which he didn't do. It never happened, never will happen probably. But anyway, those are just two examples of failures. I'm not just picking on the United States, but I just know these much better. But do these countries, do they learn? I know a lot has to do with the politics. Obviously, it depends on which political party is in control and what your priorities are. But do these countries, do they learn from this, or do they seem to be falling into this trap even more and more?
I think, as I say, a key element here is what the broad expectations of the country are about future relations. And the Korean Peninsula is a very good example of this. South Korea itself had a proposed nuclear program. But in that case, discussion about sanctions was effective. And a key reason for that was South Korea had strong positive relations with the US, with Europe, and didn't have this expectation of future conflict, and didn't have the concern to hamstring its future negotiating ability, quite different to the situation with North Korea, where the expectation of conflict has made it so much more difficult to make sanctions work. So I think that is a key element.
Mhm. You mentioned that so often we have to go through a traditional negotiation process, and I think you're absolutely right. But what about a country, or not a country, but an organization like the United Nations? If you start off the UN, they start off with maybe a letter from the Secretary General or somebody condemning the actions of a particular country. Then they might move to the next level, which I don't know the exact hierarchy of penalties, but sanctions may come up fairly quickly. And then, of course, way down on the bottom is actual military intervention or UN peacekeeping, which UN does not get involved in. They have to be invited into these countries before they just go in. It's not a one world government. But what would an organization like the United Nations do? I know the UN pushes for negotiations to resolve issues peacefully and to sit down and talk about them, because in the end, that's the only way you're going to be able to work it out without having maybe some kind of physical military exchange.
Well, one example of this, where again sanctions have been tried, but so far without success, is Western concern about China's treatment of its Uyghur minority in Xinjiang. Opportunity exists there for engagement of the World Bank to provide assistance to the people of this region in cooperation with Chinese authorities. So sanctions might be maintained with the promise of their easing, but to complement that action with, in this case, infrastructure investment organized through the World Bank may be a more fruitful way of proceeding, rather than putting all the eggs in the basket of sanctions, which so far have not been successful in changing, in this case, the behavior of the Chinese government.
You mentioned in the title of your book, the trade threatens growth and public health and the climate transition. What is an example of maybe how the public health is impacted? When I think of this, I think of the COVID-19 disaster that we've kind of gone through a little bit. We're still dealing with it. How does that impact, like with the COVID-19 medicines or supplies or the production or the chain of distribution, that type of thing?
Yes. Well, one pretty telling fact there is that 2 years into the pandemic, there were still close to 100 countries, 100 members of the World Trade Organization that were imposing export restrictions on products of vital importance, like bioreactor bags, for the treatment of the virus. The WTO estimated that the total value of these restrictions was around $122 billion. So here we are 2 years into a major pandemic, 100 countries imposing major restrictions on products that were essential for the handling of that pandemic. So that's just one example of how the trade weapon, in this case export restrictions, supposedly to serve science, to develop national capacity in the global sense, was extremely damaging to the efforts to deal with the crisis. And there are similar cases that apply in the climate transition, in the energy transition as well.
What would be an example of the climate transition? That's one that we're dealing with on a daily basis, and a lot of people, including myself, think that's our number one problem, number one challenge in the world, is climate change. But how is that impacted?
Well, again, one example of that, many countries impose restrictions on the import of solar panels, which are key to the transition. The US in particular has major restrictions on import of solar panels from just about all sources. And this, despite the fact that of those of US workers involved in this industry, only 14% are actually involved in manufacture of panels. The vast majority are involved in R&D or installation. So it's not serving the overall interests of American workers in this sector by imposing restrictions on the import of panels, but it is acting as a serious impediment to the transition. Another looming case, which has the potential, I think, to be very serious, is the so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism of the European Union. I don't know if you'd like me to develop that, or if you'd like to move on to something else, but CBAM.
No, please do. We've got about 4 minutes, but please do.
Okay. Well, this initiative, it's a good example of the dilemma. It sounds reasonable. The underlying motivation is entirely responsible. The idea is to impose restrictions on imports from countries that are deemed not to be taking a responsible attitude towards the transition, countries that don't have carbon taxes, for example. But there's a basic misconception in terms of the motivation. The misconception is that we have a massive problem of activity shifting to countries that have low environmental standards. This is not the case. OECD has shown there isn't a major problem in shifting activity towards countries with low environmental standards. The program as being implemented has two major problems of application. One is actually measuring the carbon content of imports, particularly if they're goods within a global supply chain. And the second is establishing how far the goods are already taxed in the country of origin. These are going to be extremely contentious issues. And looming behind all of this is a very real prospect that the carbon border adjustment mechanism will be found to be in breach of the WTO principles of non-discrimination and national treatment, a basic principle of which is that like goods should be treated in the same way. In this case, goods that are identical will be treated differently in the European Union, depending on the country of origin and the EU's perception of the environmental policies of the source countries. So an area of potential considerable friction, which again is not going to help and may indeed hinder the energy transition.
Mm-hmm. That is an excellent example of how we have to think through these policy decisions, and in many cases not listen to politicians who pull them out of their ears or something and just make them up as they go along. But we really have to think through these decisions so that we can make the right decisions and not just do something that's going to play well to our voters back home and that type of thing. Well, unfortunately, we're just about out of time. Do you have a closing comment on what we need to think about as we move forward on this, or what should we really be doing to get a better handle on how to utilize trade policy, sanctions, and those types of things?
Yeah, well, I suppose on that point, I guess so far I've been a bit negative in all the things that are going wrong, but
no, this is the world we live in.
Well,
You're absolutely right.
But it is, I think, important to say that trade can actually make a positive contribution. So I've mentioned a way in which trade restrictions are damaging. The other side of the coin, and again, let me give a specific example, is how trade can actually be used to promote the energy transition. And a nice example of this is an agreement that's been reached between the governments of Malaysia and Singapore to use hydro-generated electricity in Borneo as an export using undersea cables between Borneo and Singapore. Singapore will import green energy using undersea cables from Borneo, a highly technical, sophisticated process, entirely consistent with the energy transition and using trade in a positive way rather than through the negative track of sanctions and export restrictions and so on. So there is a positive role that trade can play and is playing, but needs to be encouraged.
That's a best practice we need to look at. Mr. Ken Heydon, you've given us a lot to think about today, and to think about something that we never think about probably, or few of us do, trade policy. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.